You all good?
We're all good. Right, welcome to Future Work Scotland, folks. Thanks for joining us. If this is your first time, very well welcome to you. If you've been with us before, I recognise many faces. Warm welcome back. I'm Sathpal Singh, everybody calls me Sath. I'm your host for this session, joined by my co-hosts, Donald Henderson and Nicola Bennett. And just a few formalities, usual sort of stuff. We do have code of conduct. We ask in short that you respect one another, want everyone to have a great time, have a really good experience, and we'll do the usual community shout-outs, etc. at the end. In terms of Q&A, we usually facilitate that through the chat. So if you do have questions for our guest speaker this evening, drop them in the chat, prefix them with a Q, and we'll sift through them and relay them back whenever Seb decides to stop and take a break. We'll take some at the end. However we go, we're happy, quite flexible here. And that's it. And I'm delighted Seb Rose has joined us this evening. It's really good to have Seb along. I've always wanted to get Seb along to one of these. So I'm chuffed he's joining us. Seb's been around for well over 30 years. He's been a developer, an analyst, a coach, a trainer, a consultant, you name it, he's probably done it. He's a BDD advocate with Smart Bear, and he's contributed to numerous publications and written a bunch of books, including the BDD book series, which is kind of what brings us here tonight. And he's already done one on discovery and one very recently published on formulation. And he's here to tell us all about it today so we can learn more. So without further ado, Seb, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Seth. So this is a session that's been, I wouldn't say cobbled together, but it's been pulled from a number of different presentations that I've given over the years. And I don't know why I came up with this idea of soup to nuts, but I've seen it, I think, recently on other presentations. And I discovered as I went through that there's only so many courses that you can find when you're going from soup to nuts. So I apologize for some of the tenuous courses that I've inserted into today's meal and for any indigestion that you get at the end of it. So without further ado, let's get into it. We'll start with soup. Behaviour Driven Development. So Behaviour Driven Development was first posited or introduced to the world by a man called, he was called Dan North, but he now calls himself Daniel Terhorst North. And he was trying to teach people test-driven development and discovered that many developers didn't like being told that they had to do testing. And so he came up with this idea of behavior-driven development and was using JUnit at the time and stopped having to use the word test and instead started talking about behavior. And I'm not quite sure that he ever really got many developers really interested in test-driven development, even by changing the name. But over the next year or two, with working with Chris Matz, he came to a point where he understood that behavior-driven development wasn't just about developers working in TDD. It was about, he managed to get it to a place where it helped the whole team, including the product owner and the customer and the BAs and the testers, to really get to a point where they all had a common and shared understanding. One of the things that BDD has really been held back by over the past 10 years or so is that it's really hard to give it a one-line description of what it is. And consequently, lots of people have got different understandings of what BDD is. This definition I took from the International Institute of Business Analysts, BA Body of Knowledge, Agile Extension. And it's quite pithy. I believe it's as pithy as this because Chris Matz helped phrase it, and it's an approach that enhances communication using concrete examples. And I think it's really important here that, it doesn't say anything about testing in this statement. It's about communication, it's about the whole team, and it talks about concrete examples. And as we'll see as we go through this session, those concrete examples make great test cases, but the purpose of BDD is not to test the software. It's to specify the software, document the software, and then finally ensure that the delivered software conforms to the specification. So this is not a widely known definition because the IIBA BABOK Agile Extension isn't widely shared around the place. This is a definition that my colleague Matt Wynn came up with and is currently on the Cucumber BDD doc site. And again, it's talking about closing gaps between business and technical people, shared understanding, small iterations, and finally automatically checking that the documentation is correct. So it's another way of trying to say exactly the same thing. And it works in this small iterations as well, because BDD is an extension of test-driven development. We are trying to work in an agile frame. We want to deliver small slices of functionality rapidly in increments and iterate on product, and so that we can change tack as we go. So this was the diagram that is shown on that page that was linked on the previous slide. And you'll see here that it is a cyclical iterative approach to delivering software. You start with a user story, and then you take the user story through 3 core BDD practices, which are called discovery, formulation, and automation. And once you've been through those 3 practices, you have developed a thin increment of working software, and you go back and you pull another user story and do it again. So discovery is about getting to that shared understanding. It's collaborative. We frequently use a technique called example mapping, which I will go into details of in a minute. And at the end of that, we don't just have we don't just have shared understanding, but we have a really a really effective visual layout of the requirements and the scope of the user story that we're about to start working on. And this, I would like you to contrast when you see it. I would like you to contrast this with what you typically see in a user story, which might be quite a vague as a I want so that. And if you're lucky, you may have 1 or 2 slightly vague acceptance criteria. Anyway, out of discovery comes a shared understanding, a really good set of concrete examples which define the scope of that story. Those concrete examples are then formulated using business terminology so they can become persistent documentation of what this piece of functionality is supposed to deliver, of how it's supposed to behave. And this is useful not just at the beginning when you're beginning to implement the product, and not just when you're trying to ensure that the testers who are doing exploratory testing understand what they should, how the system is supposed to behave, but also 5 years hence, when the team that built the system has long ago been outsourced to 3 or 4 East European countries and then been brought back in-house. And now we've still got documentation written in business language that the new team can pick up and understand. And finally, those formulated examples can be automated by tools such as Cucumber or SpecFlow, or if you decide to use a different way of formulation, a tool called Fit or Fitness, and there are many others as well. The point here is that it's great to have a shared understanding. It's great to capture that as documentation, but well, any of you that have ever worked with documentation, and I'm sure that's all of you, will know that you can't rely 100% on documentation. And we'll talk about this a bit later, but by automating the formulated specifications, you can then get the computer to validate and verify that the system that you built actually conforms to the documentation, the specification that you've written collaboratively. So that was our starter, just to give you a sort of soupy background. And now we're going into an entree. And this entree is actually, it should be the main course, but unfortunately, I have to put it here because discovery is the entree, but it's also the biggest part of it's the most significant practice in behavior-driven development. So I guess what I'd like to do first of all is just talk about requirements. And, you know, I'm dealing with a whole bundle of professionals here. So picture in your mind requirements and your experience of either authoring them or receiving them and trying to do something actionable on those requirements. And what do you think about when you get those requirements? Well, you immediately start diving into, well, you know, what does this mean? Or that's a bit ambiguous. What would happen if oh, I don't know, the time zone changes, or there is a leap millisecond or something like that. There are lots of edge cases that often aren't covered in requirements, or at least they're not obviously covered. And at that point, there's a guy called Brian Marrick who's been around in the Agile community for a long time, and he has a really good response to any form of requirement or anything that he's not quite sure about. And he says, give me an example, because examples are exactly what we humans use to try and make sure that we've understood something a little bit more abstract that someone's told us. We say, do you mean if this happens, then that should happen, etc. So the example is core to really making sure that any abstract statement about how a system should behave is understood in detail. And building on that, again, this is from Matt Wynn. Matt Wynn created, discovered, invented a technique called example mapping. So he was working with a client, and the client was having real problems refining and splitting their user stories. Nothing to do with BDD here, just user stories. And he went in to speak to that client, and he just so happened, and it really was just so happened, to have a pack of 3x5 index cards in his pocket in 4 colors. And it was these 4 colors: yellow, blue, green, and red. And he, on the fly, developed this technique, which I'm going to show you in some detail over the next few slides. These slides will be shared on SlideShare, and Sath and team will send them out to people after the session. And these URLs in the white box in the bottom right take you to the definitive documentation on example mapping on the web, and also a video that shows it in action. So what I'm giving you here is just a taster. But before we start with tasters, you will have noticed that on the blue card, there was the word rule. And rule is not a typical a word that's typically used in software engineering. We talk about requirements and we talk about acceptance criteria. And in fact, we use rule as a synonym for requirement or business requirement, and additionally as a synonym for acceptance criteria. I have no doubt that some of you will have questions about this, which I would be happy to answer at the end. But as far as we're concerned, these 3, well, I was going to say 3 words, but these 3 cards, the words written on these 3 cards, all mean the same thing. So here's a sample rule. Members pay a reservation charge of £1. So these rules, these business requirements, they're not written in any special language. They don't use given, when, then. They don't use shoulds or musts. They're just a statement of behavior in business language. And let's dig into this example, this domain, a little bit deeper. So we're going to talk about a public library. Public libraries in the UK and maybe also elsewhere. Books, if you're a member of the library, you can take a book out for free. They're lending libraries. This particular library has decided that if you want to reserve a book, like you go in to get, I don't know, Watership Down, and it's currently out on loan, and you want to make sure that you get it when it comes back in, well, you can reserve that book, and they'll phone you or email you or something, but you have to pay a charge to reserve it. So borrowing the book is free, but reserving it for when it comes back in costs you some money. So if we were going to run an example mapping session on that requirement, and I'm simplifying it here because it's just a short introductory session. We have a yellow card, which is a story card, and the story here is that there should be reservation charges for library members. And the one rule that we're going to look at in this example mapping session is that members pay a reservation charge of £1. And it's the job of the product owner or the business analyst or whoever is the customer representative to bring the story and the rule or rules that they want discussed to the example mapping session. Also present at the example mapping session, there must be representatives of the development community and the quality assurance or test community. So this is a meeting that needs to be attended by a group of people that has become known in the industry as the 3 amigos. And just in case anyone's in any doubt, that doesn't mean there are only 3 people in the room. This is a minimum, and it's not just that there have to be 3 people in the room. They have to have different perspectives, because it's the different perspectives that make the constructive interaction that gets to a shared understanding. So the product owner or BA or customer representative has brought a story and 1 or more rules. And it's now the job of the other amigos in the room to challenge their understanding of that rule within the context of this story using concrete examples. So here's a sample concrete example. Andrew reserves a book. He's charged £1. So someone will write this on a green card and then say to the product owner, is this correct? Product owner will look at it, go, yes, according to my understanding, I believe that that is a correct example. Great, says the developer. Then the tester comes in maybe and says, how about this? Andrew reserves 2 books. He's charged £1. Product owner looks at that and goes, no, what I was expecting was that if Andrew reserves 2 books, he's charged £2. Ah, say the developer and test community, maybe we should make this rule a little bit clearer. So here we've got, obviously this is a trivial example, but this is what happens at example mapping sessions. And I've run, I was going to say hundreds, but I've run probably thousands of example mapping sessions. And the truth is that no matter how clear the product owner or business analyst thinks they've been writing out their stories and acceptance criteria, there are always gaps. Now, this is a glaring gap, but it wasn't that glaring a gap. I wonder how many of you spotted it before the tester came up with that second example. And this is one of the things that regularly happens at example mapping sessions. We refine the rules or the acceptance criteria that the product owner came to the session with. Equally, there are times, and they're more frequent than you might think, where people at the example mapping session will ask a question to which the product owner does not have an immediate definitive answer. And it is my experience that when you have a room of professionals and there is no immediate definitive answer, you can spend quite a lot of time discussing things, still ending up with no definitive answer. So rather than go round and round in circles and still not get a definitive answer, example mapping uses this 4th color card to say, we don't have a definitive answer. Let's not waste any time. Let us write down on the card the question, assign it to someone, or someone can take ownership of it to get an answer and bring it back answered to the next example mapping session. This is an extremely powerful technique, nothing to do with BDDs per se, but an extremely powerful technique for moving on and not wasting time at meetings. Example mapping also gives you great visual feedback, which is where its second power comes in. So here we go, getting slightly more complicated here. We've got a story with 2 rules. And now we have the team coming up with questions, and they come up with loads of examples. And you look at this and you go, well, each rule's got multiple examples. That's looking pretty good. Oh, there's a question. Well, if there's a question, probably we don't have there's certainly an element of this story that we're not certain about. So it's potentially possible that we don't really want to progress this story until that question is answered. It's equally possible that someone will come up with examples that don't appear to illustrate any of the rules that are currently on display on the table. This might be because the product owner or BA has made an assumption, and that assumption hasn't been shared among the rest of the team. Or it may actually be that there's a behavior or a part of the domain that the product owner is not aware of. And so these examples can be really good for flushing out missing rules or hidden assumptions. And this is where you surface things that are unknown to one person, but were known to somebody else. If you have loads of questions, you can definitely say, this story is not ready to go onto an iteration backlog. It's way too uncertain. If you have loads and loads of rules, you can pretty definitely say, this story is too big to go into a backlog. I have some pretty strict rules about how long it should take for a team to deliver a story from a backlog to done. And that rule is small. I'm not even going to say a number now, but whatever number you're thinking of, it's probably smaller than that. Finally, if you see an example map like this is cool, right? We've got a handful of rules. You've got at least 2 examples for each of them. We may well be good to go. And when an example map looks like this, we normally ask for Roman voting. So we ask everyone in the room, are you good to go? You're not sure? No, you want to have some more time coming up with examples, and then you're done. The final thing to say about example mapping, I mean, it's not the final thing, but the final thing on this particular segment of this course is that example mapping sessions are short, right? So some of you may have been to sprint grooming sessions that have lasted an hour, 2 hours, half a day. If you do SAFE, maybe you've been locked in a warehouse with your colleagues for 2 days at a time, right? These are maxed out at 30 minutes. We time box them. What we do though is we do them every day until we've got enough stories prepared for the next iteration. But we do them every day, and I typically try and do them straight after a stand-up or whatever get-together you do on a daily basis. So this is where I crowbarred another course in. So this Parmesan is actually destined for the entree. So it's going on that entree that we saw. We're still continuing with examples, and I want to talk about the anatomy of an example. So all examples are made up of 3 constituents, and it's, you know, whenever someone tells you that all things are made up of whatever, you immediately go, no, they're not. I'm sure there's an exception. There is no exception. Every example always in the universe ever has been made up of 3 constituent parts. This is the visceral rule of 3. And the first part is the context. Every behavior happens in some context. And there is always some action or event or stimulus that kicks off that behavior. And once that behavior has completed, there is always some outcome. So we have the 3 core parts of an example: context, action, outcome. And this forms the basis both of the examples that we're going to look at and also the formulation that we'll look at towards the end of the session. So let's go back to one of those sample examples that we looked at earlier. Andrew reserves a book. He's charged £1. So just have a think. Where's the context? Where's the action? Where's the outcome? Okay. The action is that Andrew is reserving a book. The outcome is that he's charged £1. Where's the context? Seb said there was always a context. Well, there is always a context. Sometimes the context is implicit, so implicit that we don't really talk about it. So let me think. I encourage you to think about ATMs. So once upon a time, there was a thing called cash. You may remember it. And we used to get it out of an ATM, which was a sort of machine in the wall. Now, when you went down to the machine in the wall with your card, how often did you think as you left your house, I wonder if the ATM has got any cash in it? Or I wonder if the power grid is up. So there are some things that it's just not worth stating. Those implicit assumptions, they are just there. And if you keep restating implicit things that are obvious, people get bored and it all gets repetitive. In this particular case, however, the context is not implicit. So remember the rule that we were illustrating with that example. It's that library members pay a reservation charge of £1 per item. And so it's implicit here, or it is a context here, that Andrew is a member of the library. If Andrew wasn't a member of the library, he wouldn't be allowed to reserve 1 book and therefore wouldn't be charged £1. So we talked about examples, and I've shown you them. I've shown you the Andrew reserving a book and being charged £1, and this is capturing an example in prose. And this is what you would write on the green card in your example mapping session. Great. But there's lots of different flavors of examples in the world, and prose isn't always the best way to capture examples. So what I don't want to leave you with is the feeling that this is the only way that you can capture an example. My particularly favorite way of capturing examples is I divide each card into 3 columns and have the context at the left, the action in the middle, and the outcome at the end. This means you don't have to read it as prose. You can put numbers in there. You can put symbols, formulae, whatever. It's just a very nice, concise, easy to absorb structure that has some similarities, I guess you could say, to 3 cells in a spreadsheet. We've also recently started using this sort of symbolic introduction of context, action, outcome, the minus, the asterisk, and the arrow, because a lot of our example mapping sessions are now happening online. And it just helps if you can just type in something really quick that demonstrates that what I'm thinking about here is a context or an outcome. Sketches are fine too, right? There's nothing that says don't write a sketch. You know, if you want to do a sketch or a diagram or a truth table, any format that captures a concrete aspect of how the system is supposed to behave is suitable, as long as the people in the room can understand it. Even my art like this might be useful. So now it's time for some salad. It's healthy. We no longer, because of COVID, we no longer meet except here on these screens, talking to each other across the ether. And so we have to talk about how do we do this example mapping in a remote way. Spreadsheets can be used. So Google Sheets is quite good. Office, Open Office, so Office Online, the Excel is less good for shared working, but nonetheless, you can do colored cells and get your card colors in that way. I'm a big fan of MindMap, which is a mind mapping tool that Goiko Arjic created. And again, you can have colored cells, and you can create graphs of cards to simulate an example mapping session. Miro is everybody's latest favorite toy. It has one of the templates is a user story map, and although the colors aren't right, you can change them manually, and you can again get a pretty reasonable example mapping, a shared example mapping experience like this. This is what I use with my colleagues in SmartBear that are outside the Cucumber Studio team. And in Cucumber Studio, there's actually a dedicated example mapping tool, which has extra bits and pieces that are really good. Like you drag things around and you can take an example and drag it up to a rule, and it will convert itself to a rule, and you can move whole columns at the same time. Really quite cool. So give Cucumber Studio a try if you're in any way interested in that. So salad done, onto the main course. And of course, there is no main course apart from pizza at a meetup, right? I mean, that's traditional. Unfortunately, no pizza tonight. We're going to talk about formulation. So formulation on a pizza is about, you know, getting the right dough for your base, finding the right cheese for your topping, whether you're going to have some tomato sauce and all the other bits that go on top of it. Formulation in BDD is about taking those green cards that we constructed during discovery and putting them into some sort of persistent business readable form. So without wanting to stretch our imaginations, let's stick with the library. And here we are, adult. Andrew is an adult member. Given that he's got adult membership, he reserves a book. When he reserves one book, the charge is £1. Then he should be charged £1. What we have on the top is the symbolic example card based on what we showed, what we talked about a couple of minutes ago. And what we have in the white box at the bottom is the context action outcome from the example represented in business language using the structured syntax called Gherkin. So Gherkin is a very simple language. The words in blue are the keywords. And in fact, there's about 9 keywords in Gherkin. And we'll see some more of them very shortly. And what I showed you here is, you know, a very simple translation from the example to the formulated Gherkin. It's not always that simple. There's many arguments about phrasing and words and what terms should we use. And some people get quite energized about why are we spending all this time getting the words right? So I want you to think about that. Why are we spending time getting the words right? Because the words are important, right? Okay, so I'm not here arguing about semicolons or whether the parentheses go on the same line or on the next line. I'm talking about the words that describe how the system we're about to build, probably at very high cost, is described. And it's here that we really, the rubber hits the road, because if we can't agree on things in the words, we're never going to agree on things when the software actually gets shipped to our customers. So there's an awful lot that goes into formulation. The reason that I I can't remember whether it's me that got in touch with Sath or Sath that got in touch with me, or how it came about. But the reason why I'm actually hitting the trail, the virtual trail, doing a lot of talking at the moment, is that myself and my colleague Gashper Nodge have just released a book called Formulation. We've spent the past 3.5 years writing it. We're very happy with it. There's an awful lot that goes into formulation, because formulation, as I showed you, it's simple, but it's not easy. And the point here is to try and make sure that everyone understands the same thing, and that that understanding remains useful, not just for days, but for years. And part of this book, one of the bits of the book that I am most proud of, is that we came up with this 5-letter acronym that represents 6 principles. So to get 6 principles out of 5 letters, you know, I'm going to dine out on that for the rest of my puff. So brief. The B stands for business readable, which means that when you write them up as documentation, it should be understood by the whole team, and the whole team should understand the business domain. Within that, each formulated example, you should use concrete data, real data, to assist clarity. So you saw in the example I showed earlier that when we had 1 book, it cost £1. And when we had 2 books, oh, it should be £2. We would not have seen that if we had not used numbers. The documentation should be, the whole point is to reveal intent. An awful lot of people who use Cucumber and write scenarios using Gherkin talk about clicking links, typing in text boxes, and all sorts of things that are mechanical. They're implementation details of the user interface, or just the interface. It's not that we don't care about them, but they're not part of the business domain as such. There is a place for specifying how the UI and the UX should work, absolutely, but not when you're talking about the business requirements of the system. We only want essential information in our scenarios. So I've already mentioned about implicit contexts, and any of you who have ever worked in any software at all will know that all software systems have an almost infinite amount of read-only variables, passwords, endpoints, context that is absolutely necessary for the software to work, but has nothing to do with the business of actually how this one little requirement is supposed to behave. And if you include all that information in your given when then scenarios, it is going to be overwhelming for anyone who wants to read it. It's going to be totally unpalatable to your business colleagues who you want to collaborate with, and it will be brittle as hell and break all the time. So the E stands for essential. Take away every piece of information that does not directly contribute to an understanding of how that one rule that you are illustrating is supposed to behave. That goes hand in hand with focused, because each example should only illustrate one rule. Your software is going to have thousands of rules, possibly millions of rules. What we want is we want a scenario that when we automate it, the only reason that it fails will be if the specific rule that it's illustrating has been incorrectly implemented. Therefore, if your example actually illustrates 2 rules and it fails, well, it could be either or both of those rules that have caused it to fail. And there's a problem there, because it means your diagnostics is not as good as it could be, and you may have hidden another failure, and you will probably end up with more brittle. You'll definitely have ended up with brittle automation and a lot more maintenance. And finally, overlapping them all is brief, which is that the scenarios should be short. So I've had it here with scenarios that are 30, 40, 50 lines long. They should be less than 6 lines long. And there will be immediately people who say, well, it can't possibly do that. I refer you to my book. I refer you to some blog posts on the cucumber.io blog site that I published in the past couple of weeks. You can do it. You can do it. You will benefit from doing it. So the pizza's there. We're down with the pizza. We're on to the cheese, as if you needed more cheese. We've had Parmesan, we've had cheese on the pizza. Now we're going to have cheese on some slate plaid. Yeah, exactly. So it's a thought experiment. It's like just before you launch into the cheese, think about it. Which would you prefer if you were given the choice? Unreliable documentation or no documentation at all? And now that you've thought about that, which have you got? So my position is that I have yet to come across any organization that had no documentation at all. They may exist, but there aren't very many of them. And I have never come across an organization that has totally reliable documentation. Therefore, and here I haven't asked anyone to contribute, so I'm just going to put words in your mouth. You've all got unreliable documentation. But my guess is that when you think about it critically, it's the non-existent documentation is actually better than unreliable documentation. And the reason is, if you can't trust the documentation, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to go to the running system and check it out, or you're going to go to the code and check it out. You're going to go to a source of truth. So if you're going to go to a source of truth anyway, then why bother writing and maintaining unreliable documentation in the first place? Which leads us to why automation is such a critical part of these three practices of BDD. Here's this scenario, or rather, this is now a feature file with two scenarios in it. We've got Andrew reserving a book. He's being charged £1 for reserving a book, and he's also being charged £1 for reserving a children's book. And it's been automated. So I'm not going to show you any code, but there is some automation code that's been written behind this. And when we then take a tool such as Cucumber or SpecFlow and point it at this text file with documentation in it, it will read the lines in here. It will find the automation code and run that code against your system. And it will color them based on whether the steps in that scenario pass or fail. So it's just run the first scenario and it's painted them green. This means that each of those steps has been executed and any assertions that have been written into the automation code have passed. Therefore, you can be as confident as you are likely to get that the system behaves according to that documentation. Now we run the second scenario. The third step in the second scenario has been painted red, and red means fail. And not only does it fail, but it's actually written out the assertion that has failed. So you get immediate feedback in business language as well that tells you what went wrong. And now you can either go, well, that's because, oh yeah, we had checking that it's a children's book and because he's an adult member, there's some business logic at the back. Someone's made a mistake. We can go and fix it. But the wonderful thing here is that this documentation gets validated every time the build is run. Right? Not when once every 6 months somebody remembers that, oh, we've got some documentation with an outdated cover sheet. Let's find someone who we don't trust very much to read through it and make sure that they can sign their name on the front. This actually validates the system. What we have here is what's called living documentation. So living documentation is actually a bigger topic than just what Cucumber and SpecFlow deliver through feature files. Living documentation encompasses any system where you have a single source of truth that is validated automatically. So this, to be clear, living documentation is nothing about it's been edited recently. It's that it's been validated continuously and shown to be correct. There is a book by a guy called Cyril Martrère, and it's quite a fat book about living documentation. And cunningly, he's called it living documentation. However, that red failure that we saw on the previous slide, the third step of the second scenario, there was a failure. And what that failure tells you is that there is a divergence between the documentation and the implementation. And there are three reasons that divergence might have happened. The first is that the specified functionality hasn't been implemented yet. right? So anyone who's sitting there thinking to themselves, well, why are you testing something that hasn't been implemented yet? I direct you back to the BDD. That middle D stands for driven. And just like TDD for test-driven development, the intention is that you go through discovery first to make sure that we understand it. We then go through formulation to make sure that we have shared understanding, captured in business readable language. And then we automate that and see it fail. So the first step of the implementation is to run the automated specification, the automated scenario, and see it fail. And so in that situation, we haven't implemented the functionality yet, and we expect to see it fail. And in fact, there's a heuristic or a rule that you should tattoo somewhere on your body. And it says, never trust a test or specification that you haven't seen fail, because you just don't know that the automation is actually checking anything. Second possible cause of divergence is that the documentation is incorrect or out of date. So the wonderful thing about agile and iterative and incremental ways of working is that functionality that you delivered yesterday, you're going to supplement tomorrow with new behavior. Or you may have a new requirement that comes because the business world has changed. So documentation is living. It does change because the world that it documents changes around it. And so you must always be prepared to believe that your documentation has been made out of date and needs to be corrected. And then the final and most the cause that most people will think of is that a defect has been introduced, right? So you've written your scenario, you've automated, you've seen it fail, you've written the implementation, you've seen it pass, you've forgotten about it. 3 years later, you go and change a piece of code, and suddenly this scenario that has been working for the past 2 years fails. I've broken something, and it tells you immediately. Ready for dessert? Mango. Nice. So we're talking about our return of investment in dessert. You know, as this is the sort of thing that really keeps you awake when the dessert comes around. This is the Bohm curve. Now, it may not look like a curve, but that's because it's a log scale. It is really a curve, and the Bohm curve sits at the bottom of most arguments or most discussions about why shift left or trying to do testing earlier or making sure you get to a shared understanding is valuable. What's unfortunate is that the Bohm curve turns out to have no basis in empirical science. So if any of you are interested in seeing some of the things that we all believe debunked and blown apart, there's a wonderful book on LeanPub called The Leprechauns of Software Engineering by Bossavi. I can't remember his first name now, but there you go. Great book. Anyway, he debunks the Bohm curve. So even if you believe that it's cheaper to fix things earlier on, during requirements specification rather than once you've shipped it to the customer, there are still other reasons why there is return on investment on doing discovery, formulation, automation beyond the Bohm curve. So first, I want to channel, I don't know if Joe's on this session tonight, but I want to channel Joe Wright, who did a wonderful piece of work and blogged about it a couple of years ago, where he worked with a team and got them to use colored Lego bricks to work out how they spent their time. And over a period of 6-7 months, he got the team to go from only doing 23% planned work to doing 56% planned work, and going from 30% failure demand down to 4% failure demand. And the critical thing to see here is that he increased the number of meetings by a factor of 5, went from 2% of the time spent doing meetings to 10% of the time in meetings. And what this is telling us is that they did more than twice as much planned work, a fraction of the failure work, as in rework, by spending more time making sure that they knew what they were doing. So that's the return on investment of actually getting to a shared understanding before you write the code, before you do the test plans. Formulation. I probably don't need to dwell on this, but but language is a real source of error in software. You know, if I remember working at one company where we were talking about versions of insurance rates, and I thought I understood what that meant until when I dug down, I found there were 5 different meanings of that word version. So there wasn't just one dimension of versionality, there were multiple, and we had to nail that because otherwise the confusion just crept in. So although it's much easier to demonstrate in the discovery space, because context switching has had an awful lot of research done on it and has shown how much human cognitive ability gets slammed by having to context switch. Formulation and getting to a ubiquitous language that we all understand unambiguously is hugely valuable, and it gave birth to Eric Evans's domain-driven design, and there's lots of great work in there. And then finally, there's the return on investment of automation. Automated tests guide development. So I explained TDD and BDD just a few minutes ago. This is really valuable because when you are a developer and you go in, if you don't really have anything that focuses you down on just one piece of functionality that you need to implement, you begin to think about what if this, what happens if that, and you end up with these gold-plated monstrosities of genericity and reuse that not only don't get reused, but often don't get used. So the automated tests make you think about what is the next piece of work that I need to do, I need to deliver. And as soon as those tests pass, that piece of implementation is done. We've also talked about the reliable documentation. So imagine if you could rely on the documentation, you don't have to go and try it on run it up on a system. You don't have to go and try and find the right test data. You don't have to go and try and reverse engineer the code. You want to change, you want to get an estimate on how hard it is to make a potential change, you go and read the documentation. And in fact, because the scenarios, the given when thens are written in business language, you can just sketch out a new one and just run it and see whether it works, or if it doesn't work, see how it fails. It's an amazing, amazing place to get to. And you get a business-focused safety net. So it's written in business language, and it tells you when the code or the implementation and the documentation diverge. And it does that not just today, but it will be doing that every time you're on a build, and that will be hopefully every time somebody checks something in. And if not, then speak to your operations team or your DevOps team, or maybe you just go and sort out the CI/CD system yourself. And we're almost there. We're going into the nuts. BDD is collaborative. It's not something that testers do. It's not something that BAs do. It's not something developers do. It's the team that does it. We're talking agile collaboration, shared understanding, cross-discipline. We use concrete examples to build a shared understanding because unless they're concrete, it doesn't challenge our mind, and our minds are lazy. And if we let them be lazy, they will just blur at things, go, yeah, that looks okay. Yeah, that looks okay. You wouldn't build a bridge like that, you know, and unless you want it to fall down. The documentation has to be business readable. So, I mean, the domain-driven design, Eric Evans' work is all about seeing the business domain reflected in the software. Remember object orientation? That was about trying to model the real world. The documentation must be business readable because what we are trying to build is something that has business value. We're not trying to build something because it's pretty. We're not trying to build something because it's technically wonderful or reusable or generic or scalable. It's got to be able to satisfy our business in our context, and therefore we have to get the business involved. And there is no way we're going to get them involved if we're going to use O notation and try and get them to read REST APIs. It's got to be business readable. And as I've labored, I think, to excess, it's the automation that then finally ties it all together and creates that living documentation that you can rely on. And so there's red card corollaries to all of these green ones. So BD is not technical. It's not about geeking out and saying, isn't this a funky tool that I can run in this hypercloud or whatever? It's not. It's about collaboration. The collaborative discovery, therefore, is not optional, right? So the world is full of teams who will tell you that they are doing BDD because they use Cucumber. Or even worse, we are doing BDD because we write our acceptance criteria using given, when, then. That is not BDD. Behavior-driven development starts with collaboration. It starts with shared understanding. And actually, both formulation and automation are optional. Discovery is where the value kicks in. And if you miss out that discovery, I'm afraid you're on your way to hell in a handcart. The documentation has to be business readable, but it doesn't have to be written by the business. The business has got to approve it. They've got to read it. They've got to review it. They've got to comment on it when it diverges from their understanding, but they do not need to write it. And in fact, unless you're going to write it as a group, and I don't always suggest that, it's best that it's written by the testers and the developers, because then you get a feedback loop. If the testers and developers take away the green example cards and then write down in business terminology something that's entirely garbage, it's very clear very quickly that we have not got a shared understanding. And at that point, well, we can correct. But if you just get the BAs to write it into given, when, then, or whichever format you use, and developers take it, chances are it's going to be misunderstood. The ambiguities will still creep in. And finally, test automation is not the goal of behavior-driven development. Test automation is at best a second order benefit of following a behavior-driven development approach to software production. I expect a team that is adept at behavior-driven development to have a significant amount of acceptance tests coded up, automated from given, when, then specifications that have been collaboratively authored. I further expect a vastly larger set of automated programmer tests developed by the development team, hopefully with the input from quality assistants or testers. And I expect there to be a cohort of people with test skills and domain knowledge running exploratory manual tests to cover those areas of the code base which you're just not going to exhaustively test in an automated fashion. So automation creates living documentation and generates some testing, and will generate pretty good coverage, but that's not the goal of behavior-driven development, and that's not its primary benefit. So soup to nuts, and so I've added some indigestion, heartburn and flatulence pills to this final slide because we may need them. To the left are the two BDD books from the BDD book series, which you can get from Amazon or LeanPub, or if you just go to bddbooks.com, you will find links to both Amazon and LeanPub from there. On the SmartBag Cucumber site, there is free video training which takes you into BDD and automation using Java, JavaScript, Ruby, and C#. So you don't have to do all four of those. You can just pick one course or another. And that's there for free if you would like a short introduction. And at that point, I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Seb. Great. Really good. Lots of really good practical tips there. And yeah, amazing coverage. Lots of stuff that takes me back a little bit to the dev days. I'll cut code in a wee while. We did have a few questions. I'm just going to sift through and find a few. There was one quite early on, that's probably going to be quite far back, but it was around using this for acceptance testing. Just wanted your thoughts on that, I think. It's one I saw way back. Yeah, so the scenarios that you write. Found it, yeah. Yeah, the scenarios that you write written into for acceptance criteria. Do you feel this is useful, or are they missing something? Yeah, so the scenarios, the illustrative scenarios that I have been talking about tonight are focused on
specific implementations of business rules, and they are acceptance criteria. You know, they are acceptance tests. They are testing a single business rule being activated. There's also, and I haven't mentioned it this evening, it is in the book, we have something called journey scenarios, which are far more like a user journey that delivers a particularly useful outcome. So the illustrative scenarios focus on single rules, and they can give you very good acceptance coverage of specific rules. They're not so great at documenting how the system is supposed to hang together. And so the journey scenarios, of which there should be, by the way, vanishingly few, the journey scenarios give you that scope and that context. But one of my colleagues, Beth Scurry from the PACT team, pointed out and put it really nicely, which is, you know, the illustrative scenarios are often quite low down on the test automation pyramid. You know, they're just dealing with a particular part of the code base that is that's concerned with the implementation of a specific rule. And as you go up the pyramid and you get to the journey scenario where you have lots of things that connect together, it might seem counterintuitive, but the actual assertions as you go up should become weaker, right? The purpose of the tests at the bottom is to make sure that, oh, we can handle the 0, we can handle the minus, we can handle the plus, we can handle the overflow. As we move up into the journey, we're only wanting to make sure that we can make the journey, right? Can I buy a book? Can I take a book out of the library? And so as you go into journey scenarios and what is more traditionally thought of as acceptance tests, they should have very weak assertions. They're not about the specifics of that particular case. They're about, can I actually do something useful? Not, can I do this particular useful thing? Because we should already have covered each constituent of that particular useful thing but at the bottom and in the middle of the pyramid.
There's a question about, do you have like good documentation or some documentation on example mapping?
Yes, so the URL that was on that slide takes you to the introducing example mapping blog post that Matt wrote. And in fact, if you just type introducing example mapping into the browser, into the search engine of your choice, I'm pretty sure that Matt's article will come up on the first page. So that's the go-to resource. And as an author of a book, I have to say that Discovery, the first book in the BDD book series, also has extensive documentation of example mapping.
Nice. Great, thanks. So, a question, it was from John. I'm not sure what it related to, but so have you found a tool which helps with sessions online? I think that was early on when you were talking about planning and sort of backlog refinement, etc. But
yeah,
Cucumber Studio, I don't know what that was.
Yes, so Cucumber Studio, Cucumber Studio is a tool that you pay for. You know, you do a free trial, but in the end, it's something that you have to pay for, and it has lots of other functionality as well. So, given that they are my employers, I encourage you to give it a, kick the tires at it and see what it's like. But if what you want to do is example mapping on the cheap or on the free, then personally, I would suggest you go for a Google Doc, a Google spreadsheet, because that is almost always free, or at least free in a monetary sense. The MindMap tool has a paid and a free plan, and the Miro, if you have access to it, is funky as, but I've never had to pay a license for it because other people have always paid licenses for me, and I imagine it's not that cheap.
Great. John was asking about, I hope you can't hear that. There's motorbikes outside my house somewhere. I've seen an insane number of and statements. I think it's just to one of your earlier points about keeping this stuff and simple. I don't know what you meant by the 10 out of 20, but do you feel this should be limited to a number?
So actually, I stick by the brief of brief, which is 6 or fewer lines, and that includes the and statements. So the thing is, right, you often see, so again, go into much more detail in the book, and I'm sorry, I am plugging it, why not? But there should really only ever be one then, right? not always, but by default, there's only one outcome, because if you've got two outcomes, you're probably illustrating two rules. Now, that's not hard and fast, but there's a general statement. There should only ever be one when, because there's only one action that kicks off an event. If there was another action before that event, well, it's part of the context of that event. So there's only ever one when, there's usually only ever a then. So that's two lines taken up, because you always need a when and you always need a then. So that then means that the next three lines are up for grabs for the context. And there you might have two ands. So, and in fact, you don't just use and, you can also use but nonetheless. And I would limit it to three. And people will say, well, but this piece of logic that I want to test is in the middle of a huge user journey, and I need to get there, and I need 20 ands to get to that bit. I've got to log in, I've got to blah, 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 click this, go that. Well, so again, Daniel Terhorst North had a really good heuristic, which said, if you can't, if you have to use a huge list of things conjoined together, it means you haven't found the right domain abstraction yet. So if you need to be on the checkout page, don't talk about logging in. Say, given I'm on the checkout page, or given I've entered my credit card details, or whatever it is, find the abstraction that gets you to the point in the process that you are interested in, and then invoke the action that is going to cause the behavior that you want.
Great. There was a bit of chat about, the earlier on when you were working through some examples, and you lots of things were kind of color coded, and it did spark a little bit of a debate in the chat about the impact of those who were suffering from color blindness.
Good.
That was something you had a view on or a thought on.
Yeah. So do you mind if I just get it up on the browser, because yes, that's a really good point. Let me stop that, and then we go here. Hang on a second. Where have I gone? Let's just share that then. So do you see that?
Yep, no, it's come up.
Right, so this is Cucumber reports, and you'll see that we have we've got the green, the amber, and the red, but it says passed, undefined, failed in the top, and then down the side you see the steps, and it's got the green, the amber, and the red, but it's got a tick, a cross, and a question mark. So yeah, this is the standard HTML output from Cucumber these days. So yes, I didn't put this into the slide deck. I am duly chastised, but Cucumber has it covered.
Nice, great. That's good to see, and good you were able to just present that real world kind of solution there. That's good. Just seeing links to your book. There's lots of praise for your talk.
Thank you very much.
Thanking you. Some people had to drop off, so that's great. I think that's we got to the end. We've got about 10 minutes. I don't know if there's any more. See everybody now. Yeah. So no, that was fab. I really enjoyed what you covered there. And yeah, as you said, you've got your two books out there. I guess my question to you would be, when's automation due out?
Yeah, I mean, how do you like it, Sath, when your manager says when's it going to be ready?
That's well, we did a session with Dan Vaccanti on that.
Yeah.
When will it be done? Come on, Dan.
We're not committing at the moment. So
that sounds like the sensible response. I would ask. I thought you might want to share some exciting news of when you were targeting, But if you want to keep us on that one, I think that's good. We'll have you back at some point.
We actually have two books planned. One is automation with SpecFlow, because there's currently no book on SpecFlow, and Gaspar is the creator of SpecFlow, and therefore he will be the lead author on that. And then the other is a book of BDD test automation patterns, which we will be sourcing from the community along the lines of 97 Things series of books.
Great. I spotted another question just while you were chatting there. So Paul was asking about sort of journey scenarios. So do you recommend using Cucumber for journey scenarios, and should journey scenarios genuinely be kept to less than 6 steps?
Great question. Yes, we do use Cucumber for journey scenarios because that way you get a consistent level of documentation and you can structure them within the same structured output. And no, the brief acronym applies to illustrative scenarios. Journey scenarios are frequently much longer than that. And therefore you get all the dangers of having long scenarios. And that's why the two things about journey scenarios that I think I did say during the talk, but I'm going to stress again, is you should have vanishingly few of them compared to other forms of tests, and they should have much weaker assertions because they're not there to check specifics, they're there to check the flow, the configuration.
Great, fantastic. I don't see any more questions. That was a good bunch of questions there. Thank you all. Anything else? We've got another 5 minutes or so, and I can wrap it up and maybe let's Emily and give people 5 minutes back. I don't know if anybody wants to unmute. And I've got one here. Have you come across Graph Walker? Question from David.
No.
What is it? What is that? Happy for you to enlighten us if you want to unmute and tell us a bit more. If you're up for that. Can't see you on the screen.
Hi. It's just something which I sort of came across in my travels. It seemed to basically be a graph which you kind of traverse. So you've basically got a flow chart essentially, which you can use for your automation. Just wondering if you'd seen that.
Nope, I haven't. So there are an awful lot of different automation frameworks or automation techniques around. I guess I limit myself to the ones that are either very common or I'm particularly interested in. I will have a look at Graph Walker because it's always nice to see new things. Does it have a particular, have you used it, and does it have a particular use case that you think might fit into behavior-driven development?
I haven't used it, but I believe it's something which Spotify use for basically tracking through their flows of user actions.
Okay. So, clearly if Spotify use it, then everyone will be using it within a year or two.
I think it's actually been out for a couple of years, but there's a new version recently.
Fair enough. I'll take a look. Thanks for that.
Thanks for sharing more. Appreciate it.
No problems.
I think we're good. Any last questions, folks? Anybody got any last questions for Seb? Will we free him from the?
They're all going. Look, that's good. To anyone who's left,
I think you're off the hook, Seb.
I am. Both my Twitter handle and my email is on the slide deck. So feel free, if a question crops up, ping me a question over more traditional asynchronous material channels.
Nice, brilliant. No, I appreciate that. Listen, thanks for joining us for this session. Loved it, really informative, and of course, you've plugged your new book. So if you want to check out Seb's books and the BBD book series, they're available on LeanPub, they're available on Amazon. I've got them both and trying to get around to kind of reading them. There's a lot of really good stuff in there, and as Seb mentioned, he's also got a lot of really great stuff on the Cucumber site and the blogs, etc. that he and the other guys have been kind of keeping us educated through for some years now. So no, brilliant. Thanks for coming along. Really appreciate it. Great talk. So we a round of applause for me because I'm unmuted. So thank you. We will share your deck will be available. We'll have the recording out. So if you want to go back and watch it again and digest some of the deeper elements of some of the stuff that Seb's talking about, you'll have the opportunity to do so. Yeah, great. So just the usual sort of community bits and pieces to round off with. So our friends at Heart of Agile Scotland, they've got an event next week. For any of you who are quite keen to go along to theirs, they've got a couple of speakers coming along next week to talk about digital transformation at the passport office. So that sounds like it could be quite interesting. I don't know, there's also the Lean Agile Global Conference Monday, Tuesday next week. I'll hopefully see some of you there. I'll be there joining Jose and the guys. I'm also speaking this year, so really looking forward to that. So hopefully some of you are going to go with that. And then, yeah, we've got a whole bunch of other sessions that I think most of you have seen. I've mentioned them over the last few weeks. So they're all in there and available for you. We're just trying to finalise plans for a session with Esther Derby, which will be in summer. And we're also going to do a session with Ben on his work on the UDA loop. So that will be really cool. So they're in the pipeline, as it were. And I'm sure we'll have other good stuff for you coming up. But our next one is in early June. We've got 3 for you in June. So the first one's with David Goldsmith. So he's a very entertaining man. So definitely recommend that. He's a TED speaker, etc. He's written this amazing book that I think I showed you in a previous session if you were with us before. He seems to have done a bit of everything. So he's a very rare. Donald's holding it up for you. It's a chunky tome of a book. And it's, yeah, he's a very, very insightful and bright man. So he's going to be talking about his work there and enterprise thinking. It's kind of what we're quite keen for him to sort of do more of a deep dive on with us next week. So do join us for that. As I say, he's very insightful, very entertaining. So it's sure to be a great session. And I think that's all. If there's anything else anybody wants to mention that's coming up that you're maybe signed up for, or you want to plug your own event, if you're a organizer yourself, I'm happy to let you do that in our session. We're all friends here, so you can unmute and share if you want. If not, then we'll bring it to a close, give you back some time, and maybe you've got some sun wherever you are. You can enjoy that. We've just got clouds now here, so. Seb, you look like you're about to share.
Yes, I was just going to say that the BCS Edinburgh has got Ryan Lewis talking about cryptocurrency on June 4th.
Excellent.
So
right, well, there we
if
go.
you're interested in that, edinburgh.bcs.org will get you there.
Excellent, thanks, Seb. So something else for your diaries if that sounds of interest to you. And yeah, thanks for joining us. Great engagement as ever, super questions, and enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever you are. And we'll hopefully see you again over June for what should be a great bunch of sessions. Thank you, folks. Take care. All the best.
Good night, folks. Thank you.